If we haven't met, my name is Alison, and together with my husband James, we've been coming to Ascension for the last year and a half. And we've been married almost 2 years, and we're actually coming up to celebrate our second wedding anniversary in a couple of weeks' time. And I want to start this morning by sharing a story from day 2 of our marriage, which coincidentally was also Mother's Day, although that's not actually that relevant to the story. So, day 2 of our marriage, it's the day after our wedding, and we were at Heathrow Terminal 5, killing time before our flight. Our flight had some problems with it, so we had hours and hours to kill. So we do what you always do at the airport, and we went to the shops and ended up in the duty-free shop. And because we had all this time, we thought, let's go and try out all of the expensive perfumes. So we had this really fun time. It was, again, those little tester bits of paper, squirting the different perfumes, comparing the scents, deciding which ones we liked, which ones we definitely didn't like. And I'm not much of a perfume person, but this was quite a lot of fun. And there was this one particular perfume that we both quite liked the smell of. But as James was passing the tester bottle back to me, it slipped through my hand and smashed all over the floor. And I was there like, oh my goodness, this perfume costs £50. I would not spend £50 on a bottle of perfume for myself, let alone one that is all over the floor. I was like, this is not a good start to our honeymoon. We spent so much money on the wedding, we really don't need any extra expense right now. And it was just very, very embarrassing. And so we waved the shop assistant over, and she was actually really lovely about it. She came over, we apologized profusely. She didn't make us pay for it, she mopped it up, and then we very sheepishly made a swift exit out of the shop. And it was then that we discovered that this perfume was now all over James's shoes. And I should mention at this point that James had decided that he was going to dress up for our flight because he was convinced that if he told everyone we were on our honeymoon and if he dressed up smartly, they would definitely upgrade us. And sadly, this didn't work. I don't know if this has ever worked for anyone, but, it didn't. But it meant that he was wearing his really nice new leather shoes, which he'd only worn once before, which was for our wedding the day before. And they were now covered in perfume. And we tried to mop it up, but as we looked closer, we realized that the leather was beginning to corrode and was beginning to sort of pull away from the sole of the shoe. And sadly, those shoes were never quite the same again. And what's more, we had to endure the smell of this perfume for the entire 11-hour flight to Cape Town for our honeymoon. So I guess what I'm saying is that I do have a bit of experience of smashing expensive bottles of perfume. And in our passage here this morning, we've got a story of another woman who smashes a bottle of expensive perfume. And whilst it was no doubt a bit embarrassing for those who were there witnessing it, this was no accident. This was instead an extravagant act of worship. Now, we've been working through Mark's Gospel as a church over the last few months, and we're now into the final chapters. We're building up to the climax of the book, Jesus' death and resurrection. And just before we get into the Passion narrative, just before we get the account of the Last Supper and then the subsequent arrest, trial, and death of Jesus, we get this short episode where Jesus is at a dinner party and a woman comes in, breaks a jar of perfume, and pours it over his head. And throughout his gospel, Mark has been building up this picture of who Jesus is and what he came to do. And as we draw to a close of the book, as the action ramps up, the inevitable question is, how are you going to respond? Now that we've seen all that we've seen about Jesus, what does he mean to you? Or in other words, what is Jesus worth to you? And I think in our passage here this morning in Mark chapter 14, we get an answer for how we should respond. Because we see with this woman's response that her response is one of extravagant worship. And I think there's 3 lessons we can learn from her this morning, which are going to be the 3 points of our talk today. Firstly, don't care about what anyone else thinks. Secondly, get your priorities right. And thirdly, worship the one who is worthy of it all. So firstly, don't care about what anyone else thinks. If you have the passage still open in front of you, look down at verse 3 with me. It says, While he was in Bethany, reclining at the table in the home of Simon the leper, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume made of pure nard. She broke the jar and poured the perfume on his head. Now you can imagine the scene. We've got Jesus relaxing with some friends, the wine's flowing, everyone's chatting, having a great time. And then in enters this woman who comes up to him and covers him in perfume. It's a bit of a strange event. What on earth is going on here? Now, Mark doesn't often name people in his gospel, but in the account that John gives us in John chapter 12 for this event, the woman is named as Jesus' friend Mary, and it's explained that they're at a dinner party with her brother Lazarus after Jesus had risen him from the dead. So the fact that this woman comes in isn't necessarily a rude interruption. She's not necessarily an uninvited guest or a stranger, but it's certainly a weird thing to do. And as we read on, we can see it's not just any perfume. It's a very expensive jar of perfume made of pure nard. It's not even a £50 bottle of perfume like the one I smashed at Heathrow Terminal 5 duty-free. As we look down at verse 5, we see that those around her say that it would have been worth more than a year's wages. Just imagine a jar of perfume worth tens of thousands of pounds. It seems absolutely ludicrous to throw that all away. It's extravagant, it's completely over the top. And I think in doing so, this woman is opening herself up and putting herself in quite a vulnerable position. It's quite an intimate act to go up to someone and pour perfume over them. And it's demonstrating the depth of her affection and respect for Jesus. And she does it in full view of everyone else. She's quite literally pouring out her riches in worship, not thinking of the cost or what others would think. And I can imagine if any of us had been there, and I know I certainly would, have felt pretty awkward if this had happened. This is sort of a very exuberant worship. It's full on. She was going all in, fully committed to her act of worship. And those around her thought she was being completely ridiculous. But she didn't care about that at all. And this woman is not the only person in the Bible who abandons themselves in worship when they grasp just who God is. There's this great passage that I love in 2 Samuel chapter 6, where King David is just so overcome with worship, he's so in awe of who God is and what God has done, that he's described as dancing with all his might. And he's actually scorned by his wife, who doesn't think this is behaviour very becoming for a king. And he famously says to her, "I will become even more undignified than this." Because in that moment of worship, it didn't matter what he looked like. It didn't matter what anyone else thought. It was just about him expressing his devotion and praise to God. I will become even more undignified than this. Those of you who've been around the church for a while may well remember that Matt Redman song from about 20 years ago that was based on this verse, which, don't worry, I'm not going to sing it for you, but the lyrics went something like this. I will dance, I will sing, to be mad for my King. Nothing, Lord, is hindering the passion in my soul. And I'll become even more undignified than this. Some might say it's foolishness, but I'll become even more undignified than this. Does anyone remember that song? I hope it's not just me. Yes, good. Thanks, James, for enthusiastically putting your hands up at the back. And I've got this really vivid memory of singing this song on a Christian summer camp when I was aged about 10 and just dancing around like crazy to it because, everyone was just having an amazing time. And I think there's something we can learn from children from this. I think when you look at children, you saw the children this morning dancing to the Action song, they often don't care what other people think about them. They just go for it. They're all out in worship. And I found this quite challenging. I found myself asking, when was the last time that I was so overcome with worship that I couldn't contain myself? When was the last time that I was so overcome with love and awe at who Jesus is that I completely abandoned myself to worship? I think that's sort of a challenging question. It's probably a challenging question for you too. Now, what I'm not saying is that we should all break expensive jars of perfume and pour it around everywhere at church, or even that we should just start dancing in the aisles every Sunday morning. Although, if you do feel led to do that, don't let me stop you. I mean, exuberance in worship will look different to different people. We've all got different personalities. God has created each of us differently. So one person's exuberance might look very different to someone else's. But I think we can all ask ourselves whether we let ourselves experience the full range of emotion in worship, or do we try and maintain a sense of respectability, muting our feelings and limiting our worship because we're embarrassed about what other people might think of us. And I think this is a particular challenge for us here in the UK, where our British culture is very much against any sort of exuberant display of emotion. I mean, if you've ever sort of cried on the tube, you know that people don't really like that. And I think we almost judge people for being too emotional because we're supposed to, bottle it all in, keep a sort of, calm demeanour. But we see that is not what this woman does. She did not hold anything back. She didn't care what other people thought. She got that Jesus was special, and she responded accordingly. She gave what she had to show him the highest honour, to show that he was worth more than any expensive perfume to her. And Jesus saw that and described it as a beautiful thing in verse 6. And while Mark doesn't name this woman, he does record what Jesus says in verse 9. Truly I tell you, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. I just love that, because how true is it? We're 2,000 years later, thousands of miles away from Bethany, and we're here this morning remembering her actions. She didn't care what people thought of her. She just went ahead and worshipped Jesus with all that she had. So our first lesson for extravagant worship this morning: don't care about what anyone else thinks. But as we read on, we can see that not everyone gets this. And so our second lesson this morning is get your priorities right. And I think it's quite apt that we're looking at this passage on Mother's Day, the day when we celebrate mothers and the other amazing women in our lives. Because I think here we've got a classic example of where the woman gets it and the men completely miss the point. If you look on with me to verses 4 to 5, some of those present were saying indignantly to one another, "Why this waste of perfume? It could have been sold for more than a year's wages and the money given to the poor." And they rebuked her harshly. So we have this woman pouring out her devotion to Jesus, and those around her are scoffing and telling her off, pointing out what a colossal waste this is. She should have sold the perfume and given the money to the poor instead. I expect they were feeling quite holy and self-righteous about it, expecting Jesus to agree with them and join in the rebuke, putting the woman back in her place. But that's not what Jesus does. We can see that they have completely missed the point. As Jesus says in verse 7, "The poor you will always have with you, and you can help them any time you want, but you will not always have me." He is pointing out that they haven't got their priorities in the right order. And as a side point, I want to quickly explain what Jesus is not saying here. Christians down the ages have tried to use this verse to argue that we shouldn't care about the poor, or we don't have an obligation to care about the poor. The church shouldn't distract itself with social action. The poor are always going to be there. It's just the way of the world, and we should just accept it. But that is not what Jesus is saying here. He's actually quoting from the Old Testament law, and where it says in Deuteronomy chapter 15, verse 11, "There will always be poor people in your land. Therefore, I command you to be open-handed towards your fellow Israelites who are poor and needy in your land." There always are going to be poor people there, which is why we should care for them. And throughout the Bible, there is this very clear message of love and care for the poor and vulnerable, because God loves and cares for the poor and vulnerable. Jesus isn't saying that we shouldn't care for the poor. He is merely stressing that he comes first, even above a worthy concern for the poor. And here at Ascension, I love the many ways that we're involved as a church in caring for the poor and vulnerable in our community and further afield. And that can be an expression of our worship. You know, when our love for Jesus flows out to those around us into a broken and hurting world. And when we encounter God in worship, that should change us, and that should change how we act and how we treat those around us. But we need to make sure that our priorities are in the right order. Our worship of God comes before everything and should be the foundation for everything we do, not the other way round. And in John's account of this passage, he actually attributes the criticism around how she should have cared for the poor instead to Judas. And John then goes on to say, Judas did not say this because he cared about the poor. And I think that's interesting. I don't think this criticism was actually out of a genuine concern for the poor. Instead, I think it was there to make himself look good. And I wonder, are we ever tempted to do this? To object to how others choose to follow Jesus, trying to come up with very sort of holy, worthy-sounding reasons. But actually what we're doing is undermining others and making ourselves look better. And that's not getting our priorities in the right order. And I think we see even clearer examples where people in the passage have missed the point, in the events that happen immediately before and after the story of the woman and the perfume jar. I don't know whether you noticed when Tanya read out for us this morning, that our passage begins and ends with these two very different responses to Jesus. It begins in verses 1 to 2, with the chief priests and teachers of the law deciding that they're going to kill Jesus. They're just waiting for the right time to do it. And then at the end of our passage, in verses 10 to 11, we get Judas deciding that he's going to betray Jesus to them, and he goes up to them and makes this plan. Judas and those plotting to kill Jesus are placed in stark contrast to the woman who has got her priorities right, because they have fundamentally missed the point. Maybe the religious leaders felt threatened by Jesus and his claims to be the Messiah, and they probably didn't like some of the criticism he'd leveled at them. Maybe Judas was disappointed in Jesus. He hadn't lived up to his expectations of who he thought the Messiah should be. Maybe he was more interested in what he could get out of Jesus, rather than surrendering in worship to the true Jesus. And I think it's really interesting that after all this concern for money and worth and value and caring for the poor, Judas is prepared to betray Jesus, the man who was supposed to be his friend, for money, for 30 pieces of silver. He had failed to grasp who Jesus truly is and what he came to do, that Jesus was God himself stepping down into his creation in love to redeem it and bring new life and real transformation. We can see that the woman grasped this, and she responded in this display of extravagant worship. And Judas and the religious leaders didn't get it, and it led to them plotting to kill Jesus. And this leads on to our final lesson this morning. We've seen that we shouldn't care what others think, that we need to get our priorities right. And then thirdly and finally, we should worship the one who is worthy of it all. Because this act of extravagant worship is heavily foreshadowing Jesus' death. We see in verse 8 that Jesus explains what the woman has done is to anoint him for his burial, because he was shortly going to die the sort of death that wouldn't allow for all the usual burial rites. So he has to be anointed for burial beforehand. And this whole passage is steeped in the sense of foreboding, that Jesus' time was almost here. He was very much on the way to the cross at this point. But actually, as we've seen throughout Mark, the way to the cross was the way to his glory. It was in dying for us that Jesus would be glorified, that he would be most worthy of all our worship. Jesus went to the cross because he thought that we were worth it. We don't deserve his sacrificial love, but God loves us so much that it was a price that he was willing to pay. Jesus thought we were worth laying down his life for. And while the woman may not have grasped the full symbolism of what she was doing, she did recognize that Jesus was worthy of everything she had to give. She did what she could in the moment, anointing him with the most precious of perfumes, because she saw Jesus and knew that he was worth it. Let me ask you this morning, what is Jesus worth to you? A jar of very expensive perfume or 30 pieces of silver? Now, this isn't about numerical value. It's not about lavishing lots of money on our worship, being really extravagant and showy about it. It's rather about where the heart of our worship is. Have we truly grasped Jesus' worth? Have we truly grasped the price that he paid to set us free? Is he worth your full commitment, your extravagant worship, whatever form that might take? And we're in the run-up to Easter at the moment, and over the next few weeks, we're going to be remembering how Jesus gave everything he had for us. And I think the only real response we can have is to surrender everything we have, all that we are, to him, because he alone is worthy of the highest praise. Jesus is worthy of it all. He's the one who is truly deserving of all our exuberant, extravagant worship. The woman grasped that. Have you? And as we come to a close, I want to encourage each of us to try and follow the example of that woman today. Don't care about what anyone else thinks. It's just about you and Jesus. Get your priorities right, making sure he is the foundation of everything. And worship him extravagantly, because he is worthy of it all. Let's not fall into the trap of being lukewarm in our worship, just worshipping the Jesus we want or because of what we can get out of him. Let's worship him instead, because he is worthy of it all. Now, as we said, today is Mother's Day. And it always reminds me of Mother's Day how my grandma always insisted that it was called Mothering Sunday, which I think always made it a bit hard for my mum trying to buy a card for her. Mothering Sunday is always the fourth Sunday of Lent, the middle Sunday, which is why it changes each year depending on Easter falls. And traditionally, it was the day when people would return to their mother church, the church that they were baptized. They'd go to their mother church to remember their baptism and recommit their faith and following Jesus. And then gradually over the years, this shifted to being about celebrating mothers until we ended up with the Mother's Day that we have today. And I think that's an interesting history for us this morning. Because what if this Mothering Sunday went back to its original purpose and used it as an opportunity to recommit to Jesus again, to recommit to worshiping him extravagantly with all that we have? I'm going to invite the band to come back up now, and we're about to enter into a time of sung worship. And as we have this period of sung worship, let me ask you to consider again, what is Jesus worth to you? Could you today recommit to worshipping him for all that he is worth? It's not about us, it's all about him. He is beyond compare to anything, and he is worthy of it all. Amen.